All right, we'll get started on our brain tour in a few minutes. Before we go, let's get a few things straight. You don't just use 10% of your brain, okay? Listening to Mozart is not going to make you smarter. There's no such thing as a left brain personality and a right brain personality. You need both hemispheres to make a frickin' personality. And you don't have 100 billion brain cells in your head. We actually don't know how many brain cells you have in your head. The best estimates suggest something much smaller, maybe just north of 85 billion. These urban legends should come with a sign on their door saying, "Closed for repairs until further notice." Okay, I feel better. But you may be wondering why in the world I'm starting out our lecture series with myth-busting. I actually have a reason, and it has to do with the content of the tour. Like I said, it will start in a few minutes. We'll cover A, how our brain functions, and B, the practical applications for living some of these functions suggest. We'll both like the company because it's all about you and your loved ones, and it's all about me and my loved ones, and everybody else's too. So, given that kind of coverage, I just wanted to tell you where I'm coming from at the very start. I'm a lab cow. I spend my life grazing on the sweet grass of peer-reviewed research, and none of these spurious ideas, not that 10% or right-left brain business, come from that acreage. And so none of them will find their way to this pasture. This is a good thing. Leaning on peer review is a deal you make with the future. Leaning on myth is a deal you make with nobody. That's why I started with myth-busting. Now, we still have plenty of positive things to say. Modern neuroscience is more interesting, more exciting, more weird than any mythology. Our tour of the brain issues you a first-class ticket to amazing. I'm going to give you an example of how weird the brain can be shortly. But first, let me tell you a little bit about the tour's itinerary. There are 5 stops, which you can think of as units if you have your education hat on. The first stop, unit, is all about the evolving brain. The second about the learning brain. The third about the feeling brain. The fourth stop, unit, talks about the developing brain, looking at evolving, learning, and feeling from birth to old age. Our final stop is devoted to the main subject, the optimized brain, your best brain. We're not just going to leave the application piece for the end, though. Practical suggestions will be sprinkled throughout these lectures like pepper. We will spend a lot of this journey with our heads in the research clouds, but we will plant our feet firmly, as the song goes, on the street where you live. Okay? Now I will tell you my example of how weird this field can be. Why? Because I want to emphasize one of the broadest themes of this entire course, and that is the brain is a physical organ. And if you damage it physically, behaviors that spring from it may also become damaged. Check this out. My story begins with a person who at first blush doesn't seem weird at all. The research literature described her as an otherwise unremarkable middle-aged woman. But she was possessed of an extraordinary behavior, and possessed might seem like the right word. From time to time, the left hand of this woman would all of a sudden grab her neck and try to choke her to death, almost as if the left hand had a mind of its own. That is weird, alarming to watch, and apparently alarming to experience. The woman tried consciously to stop the offending hand from its strangely homicidal intent. She would use her right hand to grab the murderous left and yank on it. A struggle would ensue, one that would go on repeatedly. Left vicious hand trying to kill the woman, right altruistic hand trying to stop the, what would you call it? Suicide? Homicide? Believe it or not, this woman was not crazy. She actually had a big stroke in the cabling connecting the 2 hemispheres of her brain. These hemispheres could no longer communicate. The left side obviously had some suicidal ideation. The right side, which just as obviously didn't get the memo, had no such desire and wasn't cooperating. Sound weird? Not to brain scientists. Real case studies like these are actually safely moored in the protective harbor of research journals, that peer-reviewed stuff I was talking about a few minutes ago. This woman was first described by Kurt Goldstein in the early part of the 20th century and recounted by neuroscientist Vilayanur Ramachandran in his book Phantoms in the Brain years later. The syndrome even has a name. It's called alien hand syndrome. I will talk about alien hand syndrome in greater detail in Lecture 3. Welcome to my lecture series on the human brain. Today's lecture is composed of 3 parts and serves as a full-throated introduction to our series. Part 1 is called a pre-flight checklist. Part 2 is called evolutionary considerations, a seeming contradiction. The last part's entitled a cautionary tale and a perspective. Let's get started on our pre-flight checklist, our rules of the road. It's a small list with just 3 items. The first item to check off is the following assumption. The brain is a physical organ. That means it follows the rules of physics and chemistry and Darwinian evolution. In the broadest sense, I simply describe evolution as, quote, change over time. If this assumption sounds overly simplistic, that's because it's been compressed into a single sentence, but it won't stay compressed. We'll spend all 24 lectures expanding the extraordinary Darwinian physicality of brains and behaviors. The second item on our checklist is a fact. You have 2 nervous systems in your body, a central nervous system composed of your brain and spinal cord, and a peripheral nervous system composed of everything else. We're going to focus on the central nervous system, mostly the brain. The third item's a border dispute. Since we'll be talking about behavior and biology, we will immediately confront an old food fight. Messy as Animal House and just as interesting. It's the old nature versus nurture argument. The argument exists because the brain is plastic enough to gum up the view about what contributes to our behavior. Is it genes? Culture? Both? Neither? Here's my quick perspective, which is a hopeless mixture of metaphors. Metaphor A. Nature and nurture are like a plant fed by 2 ancient neurological root systems twisted together, evident as separate entities, but very difficult to disentangle. Both contribute to the existence of the plant. Both. Metaphor B. A quote. It's an old apocryphal story about the late neuroscientist Don Hebb, a famous man in my world. Don was once asked to evaluate the relative importance of nature versus nurture in the development of the nervous system. He responded with a question, quote, "Which contributes more to the area of a rectangle?" He said, "Its length or its width?" Great answer. Mixed metaphor. Here's my perspective. It's no longer an issue. Both contribute. The great research challenge is to understand their relative influences on a specific observation. It's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture. Here's an example. There's a fun website where adults ask kids cute questions and then wait for their cute responses. These are my 3 favorite responses to the question, what does love mean? Okay? From Carl, age 5. Love is when a girl puts on perfume and a boy puts on shaving cologne and they go out and smell each other. From Mark, age 6. Love is when mommy sees daddy on the toilet and she doesn't think it's gross. From Lauren, age 4. I know my older sister loves me because she gives me all her old clothes and has to go out and buy new ones. Now, what contributes more to their delightful answers? Nature or nurture? Nature certainly gives these kids the ability to speak. Nature gives us the ability to hear their answers. But natural sensory talents aren't going to give us their exact answers. There's cologne, and a toilet seat, and a big sister with ulterior motives. Hints of individual families. These are nurture issues, and more broadly, cultural issues. You need nature and nurture to get the answers of Carl, Mark, and Lauren. The last item on my checklist involves knowing a bit about your pilot. I'm a developmental molecular biologist. My research interests are the genetics of psychiatric disorders. I'm an affiliate professor of bioengineering, but most of my life has been spent as a for-hire research consultant, ranging from pharmaceutical companies to the aerospace industry. I've started 2 brain research institutes along the way and have developed deep interests in the responsible communication of brain science to an interested public. That last sentence is the reason I agreed to do this series, because I have several interests in the responsible communication of brain science to an interested public. Let's get back into the science, beginning with the biologist's oldest, greatest friend, Charles Darwin. As we'll discover, good science, like good art, wears well with age. In this part of my lecture, Charles Darwin will act as the referee between 2 opposing parties. In one corner, we have an observation. Human beings are pretty much the apex predator around here. In the other corner, we have an indictment. We shouldn't have been the apex predator for the disturbingly obvious reason that we are wimps. To wit, our canine teeth are not impressive. Cocker spaniels have better ones. Many of ours don't do well against beef jerky. Our version of claws is fingernails, which don't do well against paper. Your cat has better claws than you do. Our thermal exchange with our environment is unimpressive. Except for our heads, armpits, and bikini area, we are mostly bare, exposed, and vulnerable even to minor temperature fluctuations. How did Darwin score this fight in favor of us? How did we become the apex predator? In nature, you have 2 choices if you want to be big bully on the Pleistocene campus. You get bigger, or you get smarter. If you want to get bigger, you're going to have to wait a while. It takes about 24 million generations to move from mouse-sized elephant to elephant-sized elephant. The fossil record suggests we didn't wait that long, depending upon how you measure it. Getting smarter is the path we took. A number of theories exist in the scientific literature to explain this interesting Darwinian brew of survival and smarts. We'll look at 2 of them. The first is called the social brain theory or hypothesis. The social brain hypothesis might best be illustrated by something that at first blush might not seem much like brain science at all. It's a text message between 2 lovers, or perhaps I should say soon-to-be former lovers. Ready? Hi, babe. What are you doing? Nothing much. Am really tired. Just going to sleep now, babe. And you? In the club, standing behind you. In these few short words, we encounter a universe of motivations and intentions. It does not look good for them, these soon-to-be former lovers, but believe it or not, brain scientists think it looks really good for us. Our ability to divine their psychological interiors and motivations is the very talent that made us the kings and queens of the terrestrial hill. Heavy lifting for such a short message. The social brain hypothesis is deeply involved with this socialization. It begins with, I'm not making this up, a treatise on brain size. It seeks to explain how our big fat brains grew to be big fat brains. The cornerstone finding is an association between brain size and, of all things, social group size. The bigger the Wednesday morning quilt club, the bigger a brain there needs to be to support the social club's interactions. Sustaining complex social interactions, including understanding the intentions and motivations of others, including lying text messages, turns out to take a lot of supporting neural substrate. As Richard Roger Lewin put it in his book, Human Evolution, in the wild, learning the distribution and probable time of ripening of food sources in the environment is intellectual child's play compared with predicting and manipulating the behavior of others in the group. Many scientists believe we conquered the world because we first conquered our isolation. Those with the talent to create allies effectively doubled their biomass without doubling their biomass. It's the oddest part of our evolutionary history that we may have survived mostly because we had the occasional ability to make and keep friends. This vital role of social relationships playing in our survival will be an ever-present theme in these lectures. I'd like to illustrate its importance by comparing two stories, one happy, one tragic. Here's the happy one. Chloe and Claire Grunke are twin sisters, athletes. They were 13 years old when they competed together in an 800-meter race at an Illinois track meet. They came in tied for last, but nobody was booing at the finish line. Everybody was wildly cheering them when they finished, like they had just smashed world records. The reason was because of an incident on the field. Chloe had something go wrong with her leg. She stopped in the middle of the race. Claire was back of her, noticed, stopped her race too. Claire put Chloe on her back, piggyback style, then started laboring towards the finish line a considerable distance away. No hesitation, just help. They didn't exactly get first place, but from a relational level, they won the race. Contrast this with another less charitable story. It involved a group of mountain climbers descending from a successful summit at Everest. A Scottish team member lost his ability to see clearly about 600 feet into his descent. Then he became blind. He started making mistakes, of course, stumbling, losing coordination. He obviously needed assistance. For 12 hours, members of the climbing team tried to help get him down the mountain, but the going was slow. As a matter of fact, it was too slow. Do you know what they did? They left him to die. Had to, so they said. Had they waited any longer, their lives would have also been at risk. The blinded man's body atop a ridge was discovered by a friend months later, lying on his back as if asleep. It's safe to say most people would be inspired by the first story and saddened, even shocked by the second. I'm not telling them to pass judgment. I simply want to point to a single fact. Social relationships mean a great deal to us. Our survival depends on it, especially when the going gets tough. That's social brain theory. Our next hypothesis seeks to explain another aspect of human cognition. It's called the variability selection theory. Social brain theory may get us to bigger brains, but it's not obvious how it gets us to smarter brains. It's great to have friends and all, but we can solve problems, remember experiences, and improvise from what we experience in ways that leave other animals in the dust. How did that happen? Many researchers believe our unique ubercognition occurred because of a dramatic change in the weather. That's exactly what variability selection theory takes into account. Researchers believe our ancient relatives came from Africa. We diverged from what would become chimpanzees somewhere around 8 million years ago, though some researchers put the figure a little earlier, some a little later. And during those 8 million years, the climate of our African uterus grew more and more unstable. The net effect was to change our developmental environment from a wetter forest to a drier savanna. The area had an especially bad meteorological moment 250,000 years ago, right around the time Homo sapiens came on the scene. Variability selection theory suggests climate change has been a vital subplot in our evolutionary narrative for a long, long time. It wasn't unusual for our weather to swing from Vietnam-like humidity to cold and dry inside 100 years. If the greenhouse gases get their way, our weather will get even more bipolar in the coming centuries. So, what's an evolutionarily vulnerable creature like ours to do? The answer's simple. If you're unable to adapt to change, you're gonna die. If you can't stand the heat, you will get into the graveyard. There are creatures vulnerable like that. There's this orchid found throughout the Pacific Basin whose survival depends upon the presence of a single subspecies of wasp. The insect is the only one that can pollinate it. God help that orchid if the climate ever shifts in such a fashion that the subspecies dies off. The orchid will too. We probably had lots of ancestors like that orchid. Fortunately, we had even more ancestors like us. At least that's what variability selection theory states. We became experts at adapting not to stability, but adapting to change. We could create a database and then improvise off of it in countless ways. It was admittedly a rare strategy. It only happened exactly once in the long history of life on Earth. Killer whales are smart, but they don't write novels. Crows are smart. They can't design microchips. We can do both and a lot more. Theory states there is a direct line from our ability to adapt to change to our ability to send people to the moon. That's a subject we'll take up in more detail in a few lectures. Before I leave this introductory lecture, I'd like to make two comments about Charles Darwin. The first involves a cautionary tale. The second involves a perspective. The cautionary tale is illustrated by author Rudyard Kipling, a fellow Brit and a contemporary of Charles Darwin. He wrote a book entitled Just So Stories. This was a collection of tales for little children. It's delightful storytelling, offering whimsical explanations for a wide variety of observable biological phenomena. Titles include How the Camel Got His Hump and How the Leopard Got His Spots. One of my favorites is entitled simply The Elephant's Child, though it could easily have been subtitled How the Elephant Got His Trunk. The story begins thusly. In the high and far-off times, the elephant, oh best beloved, had no trunk. He had only a blackish bulgy nose as big as a boot. The protagonist is a trunkless elephant child, a curious soul always asking too many questions. The story begins with him wanting to know what crocodiles have for dinner, and nobody will tell him. Frustrated, he finds a crocodile and asks him directly. The crocodile says, "Come hither, little one, and I'll whisper." The naive baby does so. Immediately the croc grabs the child by his bulgy nose and starts pulling hard. The nose begins to stretch as the little elephant struggles against the wily reptile. Eventually, the baby is rescued by another reptile, a snake, who wraps himself around the elephant's leg, pulling in the opposite direction. The hapless elephant's trunk stretched out 5 feet as a result of the struggle. Kipling continues, "You will see and understand that the crocodile had pulled it out into a really, truly trunk, same as all elephants have today." These are wonderful narratives. You should all read the book, especially if you want to experience the linguistic sophistication Kipling expected his little readers to understand. But I have another reason to mention this story besides a book club recommendation. While Just So is a delightful storytelling, it is lousy science. That comment is actually the reason why I bring this up. Therein lies our cautionary tale. In a few minutes, the flight of this lecture is going to make its first stop in evolution land. But before we land, I'd like to warn you about a mistake we scientists make trying to explain evolutionary processes. It involves just-so stories and requires me uttering the following sentence. Ready? Evolution through natural selection is a deterministic process, sort of, favoring the mechanistic selection of successful traits. It is something of a match game between two players, an environment and a creature. The environments have specific physical characteristics. Some environments are dry, like deserts. Some environments are cold, like the Arctic. If you want to survive in those environments, you as a creature will also need certain characteristics, ones that allow you to counteract the negative effects. The naked mole rat is not going to survive in the Arctic very long. State one obvious example. The creature. This is usually the hardest part to understand. Species on the outside often look similar, even identical. That's not true of their genetic innards. Even creatures of the same species are not genetically identical. No two people have exactly the same genetic code working in exactly the same way, not even identical twins. We call many of these genetic differences mutations, and it's one of the ways organisms change over time. They're mostly harmless. The vast majority of mutations do nothing to increase or decrease a creature's ability to survive its environment. But not all mutations are neutral. Occasionally, you'll get harmful ones. For recent example, just look at the aristocracy of 19th century Europe. A few may have even been beneficial. That makes evolution deterministic. That naked mole rat would surely die in the cold. Yet consider this thought experiment. What if one of its offspring got some mutation that allowed it to grow a thick coat of fur? This mutation may be a spontaneous event, many are, but in the Arctic, this creature wins the Darwinian lottery. The hairy rat will survive because he's now insulated. If by happenstance he finds a mate with similar mutant hairiness, they may survive long enough to have sex and pass on hairy traits to their progeny. This genetic hairiness idea is not so far-fetched, believe it or not. I encountered a human form of it as a little boy going to a circus. This circus didn't just have the big top. It also had what used to be coarsely called the freak show section, which I paid admission to see. This was a sad gallery of living human oddities, many carrying what we now understand to be genetic mutations. One of the most intriguing to me was the bearded lady, a woman who actually sported a full-grown beard. She may have suffered from a rare genetic condition called localized hypertrichosis. That's a condition where abnormal hair growth appears in certain spots of the body. There is another type called generalized hypertrichosis, where growth occurs all over the body. People with it look like fur-bearing animals. It's sometimes called werewolf syndrome. The philosophical equivalent of bearded ladies occurs all the time in nature. That's why my story about the naked mole rat suddenly acquiring a full coat of hair, it's not all that far-fetched. And neither is Darwin and his theory of evolution through natural selection. Since the brain is biological in nature, the behaviors that spring from it are too. It thus also falls under the great shadow of his landmark On the Origin of Species book. We will explore this idea in some detail throughout the lectures. Let's get back to our Just So story, which I couched at the beginning as a cautionary tale. Here's a quote from a paper in a science-based journal which possesses a mistake reminiscent of a Rudyard Kipling tale. I'm going to challenge the article to a duel, then admit I'm going to make the same mistake. Ready? Quote, Potts suggests that cumulatively, these changes in climate and the overall environment pushed our ancestors to evolve distinctly human characteristics. There are two reasons I challenge this sentence. The first concerns the tone. It sounds as if there was some deliberate, calculated strategy to make humans change. It says the environment pushed our ancestors to evolve. That is fundamentally wrong. The environment didn't push anybody to do anything. The environment simply changed. Secondly, we didn't deliberately say to ourselves, better evolve distinctly human characteristics so we can survive. No, we don't have that power over our genetic mutations either by kind or by rate. Most of our ancestors probably didn't survive the change. There were a few exceptions, thankfully, but they won the same genetic lottery our hairy, naked mole rat did. The environment didn't pull on our biology like some crocodile pulling on an elephant's trunk, conferring on us and our ancestors some trait for all time. Only those with adaptations suited to a particular environment survived, period. The reason I'm saying this now is because I often make the same mistake. Probably will even in this lecture series. Quoting that last sentence clearly illustrates some of my colleagues do too. So I will ask for your forgiveness up front. Such comments are connected to truth, but only by a very elastic band. Please keep in mind that it's not the victors who get the spoils in this line of thinking. It's simply the survivors. Now to the perspective, which closes this lecture. I consider evolution through natural selection fact, not opinion. The idea forms the grand unified field theorem, usually written as theory for biology, a luxury after which my physics friends can only drool with envy. Evolution through natural selection has been praised as the, quote, single greatest idea anybody ever had, close quote. Darwinian notions are strong magnets, pulling other ideas towards them, including the origins of human behaviors. That's going to be our subject. We are going to be able to use this magnet to put together one whopper of an itinerary. It's guaranteed to engage both your left brain and your right brain, and it will take much more than 10% of your brain to fully understand. In our 5-stop tour, you will meet strange citizens who can't see animals, scientists who make cloth from rotten milk, miles of DNA we barely understand, and practical suggestions to everyday problems based on the little that we do know. So, if you don't mind, please turn off your cell phones or other electronic devices. Make sure your seat back trays are placed in their upright and locked positions, then fasten your seat belts. We'll be landing in the world of Darwin very shortly. We are in for one heck of a journey.